It's not clickbait. I sold my G7. Yo, it's Kim, and I've used a number of Micro Four Thirds cameras, but I've only ever owned two. That was my trusty G7 and the newer edition, the G85. And now I have a third one, but we'll get to that one later. I've had the G7 for quite some time now, and the G85 I added to my kit last year, but something I failed to realize was how important IBIS was going to be. In the beginning, there were issues with IBIS. It didn't predict movement very well, so it jittered a lot when you panned, but for the most part, IBIS on the G85 and more modern Micro Four Thirds cameras have minimized that problem. I also had a gimbal, so for the most part, I didn't feel like I really needed that in-body stabilization, but the more I worked, the more I realized that I didn't really need a gimbal all the time, and in fact, there were only certain shots in every single job that I was doing that I needed a gimbal specifically. Mostly, they were establishing shots and some specialized shots. So more and more, a lot of my shoots were going handheld, and that's where the problem started. Now keep in mind, the reason I make these videos isn't so that people can copy my kit. It's so that I can give you a case study of how someone, me, uses camera gear, and hopefully that sparks insights on why I buy specific gear, and you can make sense of that information for your specific use case. So like I said earlier, I like to use two bodies for my shoot. That first body, I like to stick a wide angle prime lens on it, and that's usually the Olympus 17mm 1.8. On the second body, I like to use a portrait lens, and that's the 42.5 1.7mm from Lumix. Now for the most part, this is a really versatile setup, and I can do an entire shoot with just these two bodies and two lenses. I never really find myself caught off guard when I have this setup. However, only one of the bodies has IBIS, and that is problematic. Now if you don't know, wider focal lengths are always easier to stabilize versus longer focal lengths, so that may get you to think I should be using the G7 with the Olympus wide angle prime, but in reality that's not how it works. Basically, when you use the G7 with a non-stabilized lens, it just makes really shaky footage if you're shooting handheld. So that's why I use the Lumix lens, which has some optical stabilization with the G7, but the main point is that it's still really quite limited. Optical stabilization is just not as good as in-body stabilization, especially with the modern cameras we're getting today. Now obviously there are solutions to this. You can use a tripod, a gimbal, a camera strap to help you stabilize, but the point is it makes you work harder, and when you're getting paid to shoot, there's a lot more pressure. So that's basically it. That's the main issue. A lot of my shots are becoming more and more handheld, and I'm just getting used to that workflow, and the G7 just wasn't doing it for me anymore. There were a lot of positives with the G7 though, and I really liked using it with a gimbal. For the most part, it's lighter than the G85, which I actually noticed, and I think 99% of the videos I upload on YouTube were made on the G7. It's a great camera. The image quality out of it is great. It shoots great 1080p and 4K, and I feel like this is not talked about enough. Just because a camera can shoot 4K, it doesn't mean it can shoot 1080p well. And there's some cameras out there like some of the Sonys that shoot 4K incredibly well, but shoot 1080p really muddy, and that's not a situation you want to be in, because you always want to have that flexibility of shooting good 1080p and good 4K. But all this to say that the G7 is an incredible camera. 3 years after its release date, I can't believe you can still pick it up for around $500 with a kit lens, and it would still be a bargain in 2019. It's not for everyone, but for specific use cases, the G7 is still an incredible buy. But I sold it, and I actually said goodbye to it as I handed it over to its new owner. I wasn't expecting that, and neither was he. But I did get a new camera, and I'm gonna be testing it out before I put out a video about it. But fair warning, a lot of people were underwhelmed with this camera, but it ticked all the right boxes for me. It was small, it was affordable, it had IBIS with IS lock, and the image quality was great. And at the same time, I think it's a pretty nice looking camera. So if you haven't guessed by now, it's the Lumix GX9. I know many of you guys are video shooters and probably haven't considered this camera, but I'm definitely into both stills and video, and I've had this camera for a couple of weeks, and I'm really liking it a lot. So that's basically it. I just wanted to keep you guys in the loop. I sold my first Micro Four Thirds camera, and it was a surprisingly emotional experience, which I was not expecting. But I hope this video gave you insights about what are some good reasons to upgrade your camera bodies and maybe what are not. But I hope you don't stop following my channel because of this. I am still a Micro Four Thirds shooter after all.